The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I'm very pleased to welcome to the show for the very first time, Carol-Ann Johnston. Carol-Ann, welcome.
Hi, Rebecca. It's nice to finally see you and meet you.
Yes, after all of these years on social media, we've run across each other pretty much in the same Seymour circles, I would probably.
Yes.
So if you don't already know Carol-Ann, she runs the Jane Seymour page. What's it called exactly on Facebook?
Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife.
There we go. So if you love Jane Seymour, I highly recommend that you follow her there because she's always sharing all kinds of fascinating information. But today I have Carol-Ann here to talk about her book, Jane Seymour, An Illustrated Life. And of course, you guys know if you're listening to the show, I'm obsessed with Thomas Seymour and the Seymour family. But mostly my focus is on Thomas, not so much on Jane or his other siblings. So I love when I have the opportunity to welcome a guest on the show who has a focus on a topic such as Jane Seymour. So I have to know, Carol-Ann, what attracted you to Jane Seymour in the first place?
I've always been a big fan of the six wives of Henry VIII. They started very young in school. I remember thinking in a lesson that six queens is pretty unusual, pretty cool. And then as I got older, obviously delved into what that meant and learned obviously more the ups and the downs of being the wife of Henry VIII. But I always came back to Jane Seymour because she seemed to be overlooked. If you Googled or looked up books about her, there wasn't quite as many, whereas for, say, Anne Boleyn, Catherine of Aragon, even Catherine Parr, you can find quite a few works, especially about the first two wives and a few about the last wife, whereas wives Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard don't always get as much attention, probably because of the length of their reigns, but also maybe also for Jane and Catherine Howard especially, the documentation, the lack of documentation as a whole, because they weren't foreign-born princesses, they were English-born and realistically should never have been queen. So no one was really documenting their lives in great detail until they became caught Henry's eye. Jane has always been, for me, it's been a lack of attention towards her, but I almost felt connected to her in a way because she always seemed to fade into the background. And as a child, I was chronically shy. If I would do anything not to be the center of attention, I used to love listening to people, answering questions, not so much questioning. So yeah, I felt in a way that maybe similar personality, possibly. We preferred to be in the background, watching, getting on with things, talking to people we were closest to. And it was little things like that. And it started from there and it grew. And also, obviously, as I've said, she doesn't have a lot of attention and following. So it was just to try and increase that. And I never expected the page to be as big as it is. When I first started it, I was actually figuring it out as I went along. It started as a group. And I thought, if I can get 100 followers, then that's an achievement. That would be good. And then I found that pages were getting more and more appearing more and more, so to speak, and getting more interaction, whereas groups, from my point of view, I don't know if anybody else's, seem to be almost a bit old-fashioned and clunky. Strange word. But the pages seemed to flow a lot better. It was easy to update them, easy to post. So I changed to a page and it grew slowly at first. And then I remember there was a phase of all the Tudor pages sort of saying, if you share mine, I'll share yours. You didn't have to, but it was a nice little thing just to make you aware of each other's page. And then from the start of there, then it really started going up and up and up and out, and yeah, and I think it's managed to somehow get to 12,000, which is pretty shocking.
Yeah, that's a great number. Definitely. I like how you said that you feel like you kind of relate to Jane a little bit because that's how I've always felt about Thomas Seymour. I feel
Hmm.
like there is just something about his character that I can relate to that helps
Hmm.
me understand him. So it's kind of nice to hear that you have
Yeah.
that same feeling with Jane, but I do wonder, and I'm curious what you think about this. Do you think there were any similarities as far as level of ambition that Jane had that was like her brothers, Edward and Thomas?
That's difficult to answer because we have so little from Jane herself. But as a whole, the Tudor court was about progressing. As I've already said, no one saw an English woman becoming Queen of England. The only previous woman who had done it recently was Elizabeth Woodville, and that had caused its own problems and crises. And it wasn't thought it probably wasn't thought it would be done again. But the a Tudor woman had a very limited career. They went to court, and their ambition, or their family's ambition, was to make a good marriage, have a family, and extend that family's influence. So I think there would have been a degree of ambition to do the best she could. She didn't want to be left behind, so to speak, because that would be one of the worst things for a Tudor woman, to be sat on the shelf. And it is interesting that Jane was remarkably old for her first marriage, when she did marry Henry. She did have an almost betrothal a few years earlier, but came to nothing, unfortunately. So I think also with that failed betrothal, that may have been another kick to her to maybe, right, I must do something. I must be married. As that was really all she could do. She could progress at the Tudor court. She could perhaps be closer to the Queen, if she did a good job. Was seen to be, and seen to be is an odd phrase. She was religious and pious. I don't believe any of that was faked or put on. And especially in Catherine of Aragon's household, with them being similarly inclined beliefs wise, it likely would have got her noticed. Unfortunately, we don't have any record specifically of that. As when Jane was likely first started at court was the beginning of the Great Matter, when obviously Catherine would have had a lot more problems to focus on at the time. But I think there would have been a level of ambition to do well, to become queen, probably not at first, but unfortunately, and unfortunately for Anne Boleyn, she proved herself it could be done, and that left it open for absolutely anyone and everyone to try to get their daughters, sisters, nieces, the king's eye, basically. So, and if Jane had said no, she wouldn't have been backed up. Her family would have thought she was, quite frankly, an idiot. They would not have supported her. They would not have protected her if Henry had become offended. Likely he would have. So I think that there was a certain degree of ambition, but she didn't start off looking to be queen.
Mm.
That there was an opportunity presented, and she took it, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Could you say the same thing about Thomas Seymour with Catherine Parr after Henry VIII died? He saw an opportunity, right?
There was an opportunity, but there was also, they were linked prior to Henry's interest in Catherine, so there was an element of, if Henry hadn't come along, likely Thomas and Catherine would have married before Henry. But obviously Henry comes along and the king gets priority.
Yeah.
But I think Thomas was ambitious. They all were in different ways, apart from possibly Henry Seymour, the lesser known Tudor brother. He does seem to have been quite content. He in the country, for lack of a better word, he was quite happy attending court the odd time. He worked for his sister when she was queen. Um, and he progressed in a bishop's house, I believe. Unfortunately, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. He did have some little areas of progression, but it was never to the level of Edward, Thomas, and Jane. He was not a semi-permanent court fixture in any way. I think ambition-wise, it does lie with the Tudor trio, Tudor Seymour trio, even that we recognise mainly. Sometimes I think the other Seymour siblings, maybe apart from Elizabeth Seymour, do get forgotten about. It's not always realised they exist.
Right, right. Oh, there were other kids other than those three.
Yeah. Oh my God, where did they come from?
Yeah, whoa, they had a bunch of kids. I didn't know. Carol-Ann, let's go back a little bit because you had mentioned Jane's almost betrothal. And I always think this is an interesting part of her history. So let's go back to who that was and what happened and maybe ideas that you have about this whole thing.
This betrothal came about. We're not entirely sure how, but it's believed Sir Francis Bryan, who seemed to favour the Seymour family and certainly helped each of Edward, Thomas, and Jane a little bit here and there. He was close to the Boleyns and the Howards at first, but seemed to move away from them later. So it's believed that he may have made the approach to the Dormer family, who had one son, William Dormer. But unfortunately, Francis Bryan did not have the best reputation. He was a bit of a scoundrel. He liked to have fun. He was interested in everything and anything, basically, and his reputation preceded him. And it's thought that William Dormer's mother may have seen and believed that Jane being put forward by him possibly didn't have as great a character, which is a little unfair to Jane. But it's possible that she was influenced by the reputation Sir Francis Bryan had. And the betrothal didn't get to any firmly concreted that it needed broken off. It was talked about, it was discussed, it seemed like it might happen, it didn't, and William Dormer was married off elsewhere. But it is also possible that the Seymours and the Dormers knew each other socially. They were near to each other in the area of their homes, and they may have known each other, and it may have been a family to family, and Sir Francis Bryan may have had nothing to do with it. However, unfortunately, that presents itself another problem because it's believed Sir John Seymour, Jane's father, maybe had an affair with his eldest son's wife. We're not sure. There's mentions of it, and we do know that Edward Seymour disinherited his first two children with Catherine Falal, his first wife, and that is quite a drastic action to take, unless when you think about it, he thought the children were not his. And it was a big scandal at the time. There seemed to be people were maybe aware of it, sort of in the scene and not heard. They did speak about it, but it wasn't gossip to the level of, say, the Great Matter. But people were aware something had happened, and it seemed to be that sadly Sir John did have some sort of relationship with Catherine Falal, which broke apart his son's marriage and obviously damaged Jane's prospects and essentially all of his children's, really, because the children of such a father may not be guilt by association. Maybe if that's what the father's doing, what's the children going to be capable of? That could have been a thought. And that may have been another reason that his mother and father decided to betroth William elsewhere. And essentially, William Dormer, he had quite a successful marriage, and he eventually had a daughter, Jane Dormer, who became a lady in waiting to Mary I, Jane's eldest stepdaughter. and was quite favoured by Mary. And Jane Seymour herself was known to be quite close to Mary, and Mary clearly thought the world of her. There is evidence of that she was closer to Jane as a stepmother than subsequent wives. She maintained a relationship with them. She got along with them, but Jane, whether it was Jane herself or the fact that she had just lost Catherine of Aragon, her own mother, and was not allowed to properly mourn her, or royalty did not attend funerals, but she wasn't even allowed to do that. It may be with Jane dying so soon after Catherine died, it came together and exploded within Mary herself. So there's the element of that. But Jane Dormer would have heard possibly from Mary about Jane Seymour, which could have been interesting, as Jane Seymour could have been Jane Dormer's mother, if history had been different. So it's funny, all the little twists and turns. But yeah, the scandal appears to have broken the betrothal up for Jane Seymour, and it's a little unsure quite which scandal it was, but it essentially was one of them. And it was also perhaps attached to the Great Matter. They were conservative Catholics, and again attached to Sir Francis Bryan with his activities. They may not have thought Jane was a pious Catholic as well, just because it was Sir Francis promoting the matter. He's likely, or it may have been thought, he was promoting somebody who had similar interests to him. Understandable, but she didn't, clearly. But it didn't happen for Jane, and she was getting older at that point. We believe she was in her late 20s when she died, and most Tudor women, or girls as we call them now, were first marriage could be as young as 13. So she was an unusually long time not married. And another strange thing about that is that Elizabeth Seymour was married first. Now, it was almost socially an unwritten code that the children were married in birth order, essentially. So Edward being after, they did have an eldest son who was John Seymour, who died young, but Edward Seymour became the heir. He was the eldest surviving son. So he was married first. But Elizabeth Seymour is younger than her sister, as far as we know. All the dates and the surviving evidence do indicate that. I have wondered if perhaps the dates are wrong, but I found no evidence of that. It did cross my mind at one point that Elizabeth was perhaps older, and that's why she was married first. But it could be, as I say in my book, it could have been a number of factors. Elizabeth was maybe the same age as her husband, or prospective husband at the time. It turns out she wasn't. But it could have been, unfortunately, down to appearance. Jane was never regarded as beautiful. And Elizabeth maybe did have something a little bit more than her sister that possibly allowed her that push. And in order to secure the marriage, if they had, as we said, they had around 10 children. If they weren't happy, sounds awful, if they weren't happy with getting through the eldest daughter, in order not to lose the marriage, oh, we have another daughter, and this is Elizabeth. Perhaps it could have come down to that, which again would have been harsh on Jane to see her sister married before her. And if that was the reason as well, must have been a bit of a kick to the stomach. No woman wants to be sort of shunted aside. I say woman, no woman wants to be overlooked for as simple as their appearance, especially when they've likely got so much more to give. But yeah, the marriage, it didn't come off, but it didn't attract, its failure didn't attract I can't think of the word, the censorship, because the Anne Boleyn's failed union with Henry Percy did. It does, William and Jane almost go on, well, Jane herself almost becomes Cinderella. She lost that marriage, but she went on to a better marriage. But in the grand scheme of things, the idea would have been her reputation was intact. There was no fault through her, and a king decided to marry her.
Yeah. I always go back to that scandal, right? Because that is the big Seymour scandal. What's true? What's not true? I think everybody can agree something happened.
Mm-hmm.
We don't necessarily know what happened, but I think my question with that is always, well, if something so scandalous happened, why would Henry VIII be willing to marry into the Seymour family, knowing that the scandal's attached to him?
That is also a good point. But by the time Henry married Jane, the scandal was several years old. Jane herself came from a very fertile family, so she had that going for her. He had met her. He was able to observe her character. So in a way, he was maybe more, a phrase I never thought I'd use with Henry, enlightened than some of his courtiers, or maybe it's simply just he fancied Jane and he wanted her at that point. And if the marriage had failed and Jane had not produced a son or something else had gone wrong, he could have dragged up the scandal and made that a part of I'm divorcing her, or worse. As it turned out later, it could have been so much worse. But yeah, it is interesting to think that he did ignore the scandal. I don't entirely know why. That is just a few theories of mine. He was very, what he wanted, he got, and Jane managed to attract his attention. And if he wanted her, that may have superseded anything else, which in the end it clearly did. But another thing to think about is we don't know. We've seen suggestions that both of Catherine's children, she had two sons with Edward, or she had two sons that were both disinherited by Jane's brother Edward. But the suggestions that one of them may have been his, the elder one, and the second one was not his, or vice versa, or they both weren't his. It's a very murky background. And yes, it was a scandal. There's no dispute in that. But Henry may have also known something else that we don't know now. He may have known the truth of the matter. But it was likely more of he saw Jane, he developed an attachment, and what he wanted, he got, bar any consequences. And it may have become a factor later. As Chapuis said, he may marry Jane on condition that she's a virgin. If it doesn't work out, he'll say she wasn't. So if things had gone wrong, likely that scandal would possibly have been a factor. But luckily for Jane, it never did during her marriage. In regards to her marriage, it was very successful.
Yeah. At this time, Henry VIII had been married twice, so he sure had a lot to think about when it came to a marriage with Jane, didn't he?
He did. He did and he didn't. He did have a lot to think about from our point of view, and you would think from his point of view as well. But he was very. I still think a lot of it was he saw and he wanted. He convinced himself he was in love with Catherine of Aragon. He believed he was in love with Anne Boleyn, but it was closer to an obsession for Anne, I think. As I say, he would have thought it was love. I don't think he was, and that's another interesting angle. I don't think he was very good, which just seems a silly thing to say, but as a husband, he was not very good with his relationships, obviously. And it's almost interesting to ask where that came from, because he had the evidence of a solid marriage with his parents. Unlike his brother Arthur, he was a lot closer physically to them. So he'll have had plenty of opportunity to witness their marriage. And the suggestion is he was looking for another Elizabeth of York. He saw his mother as the perfect Queen of England. He was trying to replicate what his parents had, and it did not happen. In his eyes, it did not happen. It was very successful with Catherine. Unfortunately, she lost so many children, which was not her fault. And their relationship was probably, we would call it stalkerish now. She had no choice. She didn't. She, almost like Jane, once she realised Henry wasn't going to leave her alone, without offending the king, there was nothing she could do. She had to make the best of what this course of action was going to take. Jane, very similar. Anne of Cleves was a reverting to tradition, a foreign-born bride brought into England, which unfortunately did not work. Likely, again, not Anne's fault. Catherine Howard was almost like Anne and Jane, seen and wanted. She was too young, I believe, for the role she was expected to play. But there is the argument that, again, a lot younger than her were being married and able to hold down marriages. There's a lot to get into with Catherine Howard as to why her life and her career went so badly wrong. Catherine Parr, again, seemed successful, but then he almost got rid of her for her religious beliefs. She was able to quite smartly save herself and knuckle down for the rest of the reign. But it's such a strange sentence to say. He was not a good husband, and the question is why. And I do think he was spoilt. He was the darling boy amongst the children in the nursery, because obviously Arthur was away being prepared for kingship. There was his sisters, Margaret, Mary, and Elizabeth. Elizabeth died young. There was Edmund, who also died young. So Henry was the petted boy and may have got away with a lot. I don't know for sure, but it may be started. He had a favourite childhood and may have been a little bit spoilt. And then once he became king, and you don't say no to the king, and then obviously all the changes that were made to allow the marriage, that all the brakes were taken off. And by the time of the end of his reign, nobody could say no to anything minor, large, middling. What Henry wanted, he got. And that was it.
Yeah. That's Henry's life in a nutshell, isn't it? Henry got what Henry. Well, let's go back a little bit, because one of the things that Henry wanted and he got was Anne Boleyn, and then he tired of her. And I want to. This is probably the period of Jane's life that I am not as well versed on. Is that end of Anne Boleyn's reign and where Jane Seymour comes in, and how she is positioned. Leading up to Anne Boleyn's execution. Can we talk about that?
Yes. Yeah, of course. We know she is first mentioned in the Eustace Chapuis letters following the death of Catherine of Aragon, and Mistress Semel, which was Seymour. He was referring to Jane Seymour, and this was he was referring to events in January. But I believe the letter itself, off the top of my head, may have been dated to February, but obviously it was backdated, referring to events that had taken place earlier. And that's the first concrete mention we have of Jane. But he does refer to her receiving presents and attention from the king. Now, if it had been going on longer, you would think Chapuis would have mentioned that, but he doesn't. So it does seem to give us an indication that Jane was becoming, people were becoming aware of Jane pretty much around the time Chapuis was writing. So this was January 1536. But Henry was unusually discreet with his mistresses. It isn't clear exactly, apart from Bessie Blount and obviously her son, Henry Fitzroy, Henry's son, and Mary Boleyn. We do not know for sure exactly who else he had relationships with. He was very, very, very discreet compared to, say, Francis I, who really didn't care who knew who was, how many mistresses he had, who he was spending his time with. Henry really valued his privacy. He did not want people gossiping about him. So it's difficult to date Jane's, the beginning of her ascension. But the King and Queen, Henry and Anne, were on progress, and they stayed at Woolfall at the end of 1535 for a few days. Now, it's difficult to say if Jane was there at the house, waited to greet the King and Queen, or she was in Anne Boleyn's household and arrived with the Queen, and essentially came home, so to speak, for the visit. But I do believe she was there. As a royal progress and a visit, it was all hands on deck. The house had to be immaculate, the gardens, the hunting, banquets, feasting, entertainment. They would have needed all the help they can get. So, as a member of the family, she would not have wanted to miss it. So I do believe she was there. I don't know how she got there, whether she had gone home and waited to greet the King and Queen, or whether she had arrived with Anne as one of her ladies. But she was definitely at court in January, because we have the first concrete mention of her receiving gifts of Henry, and Anne was certainly aware that he was interested as well, because Chapuis does tell us she was troubled by what was taking place, because again, Anne had unfortunately set herself a precedent. She had proven it was possible for a woman to become Queen of England. A seated Queen of England could be ousted. She had proven that could be done, and now unfortunately she left herself open to the same being done for her. So it's understandable why she was obviously anxious at this time. And also she'd had a miscarriage, which was dated as being the start of her decline, but she was not actually dethroned until May. Now, there's a long time between January and May, especially as Henry was getting older. He didn't have the son he wanted. So there's a question of why there was such a wait. Was there something else going on? Was he waiting for something? Was he taking advice on what to do about the situation with Anne? Because in the eyes of Catholic Europe, Catherine of Aragon had just died, and he was a widow. And most regarded his marriage to Anne as invalid. It was not done with the Pope's consent. He was still married to Catherine when it was performed. So he was essentially a bigamist when he first married Anne. Now, he could have remarried Anne after Catherine's death, but that would have been admitting there was a problem. So that was never going to happen. But he would have been aware. He was an intelligent man for unfortunately, all the things he did. He was an intelligent man. He knew his marriage wasn't recognised, as much as he hated that. So Anne had just lost her child. Catherine of Aragon was dead. Virtually nobody recognised Anne as Queen of England, Princess Elizabeth as the heir to the throne. They all still thought of Princess Mary. So there was an opportunity here to take another wife. But it's that length of time that bothers me. It's what was going on, why they waited so long. So there was a lot of it is difficult to explain, and Jane herself might have been on tenterhooks, because we don't know when Henry promised her marriage. We get the reports of as Anne was falling, them talking of marriage, but when did he first promise her this? Did he say not long after her miscarriage, or I'm going to marry you, Jane, this is the plan? Or we just don't know. Unfortunately, there is a big gap where we're watching from the outside, and we have to take as we find. So I do believe there was something going on, whether it was discussions about Anne's future, the reactions of Europe, obviously, because getting rid of another wife via divorce, annulment, was going to make Henry a laughing stock, because he'd done it once. And essentially the common thought would have been, have you considered that it's not the wives that are the problem at this point? So he was stuck. He was stuck in a situation where Anne hadn't provided the son, Catherine hadn't provided the son. It was unsure if Anne would get pregnant again. She may have done. There may have been a possibility. She had had either a miscarriage or a stillbirth earlier after Elizabeth's birth. Now, that was really hushed up. We don't know. It may even have been a false pregnancy due to the stress she was under. She thought she wanted the child so much, like Mary later on in her reign, that she almost willed it into being. But there was suggestions of a second pregnancy that ended in mysterious circumstances, but this third one was a miscarriage. And for Henry, it was history repeating itself. Catherine had had stillbirths and well, actually, no. Catherine, we believe, had stillbirths and children that died soon after birth, sadly. She doesn't appear to have had. It was Anne Boleyn who had a miscarriage. So it's... I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here.
Well, there's a lot of pregnancies to try and keep track of with all of these women.
But no, Catherine did... Which miscarriages and stillbirth, yes, they are different, but in Henry's eyes, the children were lost. And Anne was harshly going the same way Catherine was. So that was likely a factor in Jane's ascension. She had the history, as we've spoken of. Her family was very, very fertile. One of her younger sisters had nearly 20 children, Dorothy, through 2 marriages. So there was the opportunity here for the marriage. There was an opportunity to marry abroad, but relationships were very shaky, given the break with Rome, Catherine of Aragon being set aside. So Jane was almost in the right place at the right time. It could have been any English woman, but something about her had caught Henry's eye, and a lot of that argument is around the differences between Anne and Jane. Anne was fiery, Jane was calm. Anne said what she thought. Jane thought about it, maybe tactfully went about it as well. Jane did not like to create a fuss either, whereas Anne was willing to fight, understandably fight for what she thought was right. But in Henry VIII's eyes, Anne, in the end, as a queen and wife, was not suitable for the position. And he had likely become aware of that as well. She sadly caused scenes. Again, I don't blame Anne for this, because she knew... she didn't know what was coming, but she knew if she failed, she'd be cast aside, or worse, as it turned out. So she had to fight for everything that she had. She couldn't afford to ignore the signs if he was showing interest in another woman, because she had proven she could be set aside. She had proven she could be herself set aside. So yeah, Jane was first definitely mentioned regarding events in January, but officially mentioned in records in February. And it goes almost quiet up until Anne's fall. There's little pieces of gossip. She received a gift of money off Henry, which she turned down flat. He sent her a letter, which we believe would have invited her to become his mistress. She neatly sidestepped that by not opening the letter and asking the messenger to give it back to Henry, saying that she was an honourable woman. She only had her honour and she would not harm it for 1,000 deaths. And that if he wanted to give her a gift of money, she begged it would be when she made a marriage. He also gave her a gift, a necklace with his portrait in. He was not very original, because he'd given Anne a bracelet with his portrait in. So it seems to have been the standard gift for the women he was interested in. So we do have little mentions, but it becomes more... Jane's appearance becomes more concrete in the middle of Anne's fall, when obviously all focus is on, obviously, Anne's fall, what happens now, who becomes queen. There's still the succession. So yeah, we have all that going on, but obviously it is quite mixed up. And we only have the barest traces of Jane still leading up to her own accession. It is May when we really get a concrete picture that even Thomas Cromwell is getting behind her and the Seymours after he fell out with Anne. Sir Nicholas Carew, another old friend of Henry's, we believe was brought over by his brother-in-law, Sir Francis Bryan. And he even provided the house for Jane to stay in whilst she was sent away from court, like Anne had been when they were discussing the great matter, to look like, essentially to protect her reputation, so that it would look like there was, even though everybody knew what was going on, it would look like there was nothing going on, that it was Anne's fault in a way. It was Anne's crimes they were looking at. There was no other woman involved. It was just what Anne had done. And that was to protect Jane's reputation. So yeah, it is difficult to exactly say what happened when. We have little steps, but we have the most from May 1536, when Anne is unfortunately falling and Jane is rising.
I often go back to how quickly Henry married Jane after Anne Boleyn's execution. And for a while there, I was of the opinion, and I know I'm not the only one who has said this before, that maybe there was a possibility that Jane Seymour was pregnant at the time, and that's why they married so fast. But there's also lots of arguments that can go against that, aren't there?
I have thought about that. I lean more towards likely that Henry, he was getting older, he was running out of time, he had married twice, he still did not have the heir he wanted. And despite the scandal of what Anne had apparently done, he may have felt himself that because she was this traitorous, she had had this affair with all these men, why should he wait? He's done nothing wrong. He needs a son and heir. He needs a wife and a queen. So he was getting older and time was running out. So he may not have understood the benefits of waiting. And again, this comes back to his personality of seeing and wanting. He wanted Jane, so they were betrothed the day after Anne was executed, and then married 11 days later. And I suppose it's possible she was pregnant. We know that we believe that Henry and Anne consummated their marriage just before one of the marriage dates we have for them, in November 1532, after the visit to Calais to see Francis I and try and secure his support for their actions and their marriage. So it is possible. It's not impossible that they had slept together before they married. But again, it comes to time, because Jane was sent away from the court. She wasn't there in the final few days of Anne's reign. But of course, there is the argument they could have slept together earlier.
Well, and
between January and May. Yeah.
I think in my head, the problem comes in at what point did they know? Did they feel the baby stir, right? That's when they knew that they were pregnant. So was that at the end of the first trimester? I mean, because then we start looking at a timeline. Is it even possible that this could have happened prior to Anne Boleyn's execution?
Yeah. It is. There is that as well. Tudor women rarely celebrated their pregnancy or announced it, because unlike us, they had no pregnancy tests. They would have suspected they were pregnant, maybe going off certain foods, smells that they previously liked, don't like now. There were symptoms they could have suspected they were pregnant, but they didn't know essentially until the child moved. So again, I agree with what you're saying there. That was quite a short period of time as well. And we go back to Jane's letter. She essentially said she did not want a relationship until she was married. That it was a short window for her to become pregnant. It's possible, not impossible, but to suspect she was pregnant and accelerate Anne's downfall, it would have been quite the gamble given the situation Henry and the Tudor court was in, because if it turned out she wasn't pregnant and he'd married her for nothing, I suppose to save face they would have carried on with the marriage, and she did become pregnant and she did have the son, but it did seem to take, officially history-wise, we know she had one child and it took her a while to get pregnant. Now, whether that was stress, Jane, obviously, she married a man who had unfortunately got rid of one wife and executed another.
Yeah.
There was the pilgrimage of grace. Henry, the volatile husband, the plots and everything going on at the Tudor court as general activity. It was not a relaxed place to be. So that may have played on health and ability for both Henry and Jane, but it likely lies with Henry. We have Anne herself saying in a moment of anger that he was becoming incapable, to put it tactfully. So that may be the reason Jane was not pregnant officially until later. But yes, it is possible they had consummated the relationship, but I don't see a lot of evidence for that. So I accept it's possible, but I don't follow it at the moment.
Well, now I'm going to throw in even more of a conspiracy theory for you. Are you ready for this?
Okay.
Okay, let's say Jane was pregnant. Mm-hmm. We'll go against probably the likelihood that she probably wasn't. But let's say she was pregnant. They got married. She is carrying, hopefully, the heir to the throne for Henry VIII. But there might be somebody who's in the way who could take that throne away from her son, Henry Fitzroy, who then suddenly dies. Oh, do you see where I'm going with this? Is it possible that the Seymours poisoned Henry Fitzroy to make way for what they presumed could be their nephew? You're welcome.
It's possible. We have no proof either way that they did or didn't. It's certainly a possibility. It was a very cutthroat Tudor court. Henry Fitzroy was likely an obstacle to Jane's son, if and when she had one, if he had lived. And it does seem Henry Fitzroy, what we generally know about him, does appear to have been fit and healthy and sickened suddenly. But so was Edward VI later, his half-brother, Jane's son. And Prince Arthur, we have conflicting information. There has been an accepted idea that he was maybe generally not as well as Henry as a child and grew up and didn't really prosper health-wise. And there has been a suggestion he may have been premature, especially when you look at the dates of Henry and Elizabeth's marriage compared to when Arthur was born, which was officially 8 months later. But if they were betrothed and the church accepted the marriage was going to happen, they may have consummated their marriage as well, their relationship before the official marriage ceremony. There was nothing wrong with that. If they had promised each other, and it was generally accepted Henry VII and Elizabeth of York would marry. But it is I always find it interesting that Henry Fitzroy, Prince Arthur, and Edward VI all died at very similar ages, very similar issues described, symptoms. They sickened fast. The Tudor dynasty appeared, on the male side at least, to have some sort of wasting disease. Now, it was possibly tuberculosis. It was possibly something else they'd never seen before. But it's interesting to see that all three died at a similar age, and they were all Tudor. Obviously, Henry Fitzroy was Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, Henry VIII's son, Prince Arthur, Henry VII's son. And Henry VII himself did die. He essentially, after several health issues and losses, faded away himself. But But no, it is interesting that Henry Fitzroy, Prince Arthur, and Edward VI all died similar ages and similar illnesses and symptoms. Again, like Jane's possible pregnancy upon being married, there's nothing to say. I think it's unlikely. It's not impossible. Whether Jane herself would have supported any idea, I think, is doubtful. And Henry, for all his fear and horror of poison, it would have been a very tricky action to take. As obviously he instigated the act that led to boiling alive if poison was proven, a horrible way to die. It would have been a risk. And also, in Henry's eyes, he had Henry Fitzroy, but he knew him to be illegitimate. He had never been married to Bessie, and he so desperately wanted a legitimate son. So it's unlikely Henry Fitzroy would have ever been king. If he'd lived, he'd have been, once Edward was born, a significant figure, which may have caused Jane problem later, purely for the fact he would have been, apart from her brothers, the nearest male relative on Edward's side, so to speak. He was his half-brother. But I don't think there was a benefit to killing him in a way immediately. It may have been an issue later once Henry died and if Henry Fitzroy had lived, but at the time there was very little benefit. Henry himself was focused on producing the legitimate male heir with his wife. I think it's unlikely that Henry Fitzroy was killed by the Seymour faction.
Well, sometimes we come up with these wild ideas. We just have to throw them out into the universe and go, no, of course. Right? And I'm always
we'll never know, but I think it's unlikely. That there was very little benefit at the time of Henry Fitzroy's death to Jane, Henry, and the Seymours, purely because they knew how much Henry Fitzroy meant to Henry, but they also were aware of Henry was really, really focused on producing this legitimate male heir. He had Henry Fitzroy in reserve, but he never really seemed to put him forward as king. Even when councillors suggested it, he accepted Henry Fitzroy as illegitimate. If things had become desperate, again, there's a possibility. But at that time, when Henry Fitzroy died in July, he had just married Jane. He believed they were going to have children. There'd be no problems there. No, I don't think it's likely at that time.
Well, this has been so much fun chatting with you. I think, we're winding down here for an hour. Okay. And I think, it's always trying to figure out how to end an episode, right? But yeah, I wanted to end it on this scandal because what a great way to end the show. But I think one of the topics that I want to look at with you before we go is Jane's age, right? Because she died 12 days after giving birth to Edward VI.
Yes.
And then there was this grand funeral for her. And there are things that we count in these images or in the people involved that say, oh, well, she must have been this old. Let's talk about that. How old do you believe Jane was when she died?
I believe she was late 20s when she died. The first piece of evidence we have is, I did contact Alison Weir about this when I was writing my book, because she mentions in her book, The Six Wives of Henry VIII, that 29 ladies walked in procession. And that was a tradition, apparently at the time, to mark each year of the deceased's life. And there is evidence that something similar happened at Elizabeth of York's funeral. Now, the ladies didn't walk in procession, but there was 37 virgins stationed at one of the passing points of a cortege. The mayor and the lady mayoress had organised this. And again, seems like an odd number until you realise Elizabeth of York was 37 years old when she died, and unfortunately died on her birthday. So there is evidence that this was a possibility. And we know Elizabeth of York's funeral was used as essentially a guide on how to do Jane's, because a Queen of England had not died so recently in good estate. Obviously, Catherine of Aragon was buried as the Princess Dowager, Anne Boleyn buried as a traitor. So they did have to look 30 years before to find out exactly what to do when a Queen of England died. So there is the evidence that the ladies walking in procession, there was 29 mentioned. Now, unfortunately, Alison wasn't able to lay her hands on quite where she got this from. So it's mentioned, and there's the evidence from Elizabeth's funeral that there was something similar took place. But I do think I used to be sure she was around 29. I used to rely on it as gospel, but because I haven't seen the exact location that we've got this information from, I believe she was late 20s, purely based on that funeral evidence. Chapuis believed also she was in the 20s. I mean, appearance-wise, it's unfortunate, I can't remember off the top of my head which ambassador it was, but he wildly misjudged a lady's age. I think, if memory serves, it was Catherine Howard. He said, I think he said she was a lot younger than she was, or vice versa. So appearance is not much to go on, but we do have Chapuis believing she was in her 20s, middle and 20s at the time of her rise. And we do have this link of the 29 ladies in the funeral and the evidence of Elizabeth of York's funeral, which was used as a template for Jane's, and something similar took place for hers. It's that little link of where I haven't been able to find the 29 ladies in the original sources yet. So I lean towards late 20s, but I'm not entirely sure exactly what age I would like to give her at the moment.
Well, that's the problem with the Seymours, is we don't really know their birth dates. The only indication that we have is from John Seymour's tomb, which was created by his grandson.
Yes.
And would he have known the exact order of his aunts and uncles? You know, there's so much.
Exactly. Yeah, that's an interesting. I hadn't thought to think about that, but yeah, obviously the grandson. It's like yourself when you think, like, with your own grandparents now. If they had a lot of children, you would only probably be aware of, obviously, your parents, and the fact that they had the children. You may get them the wrong order yourself if they had a lot. That's certainly possible. I don't have an exact age, but I do believe late 20s is a good indication from the several pieces of research and evidence. But I would like to try and find something a bit more concrete. Unfortunately, birth records weren't mandatory until actually Henry VIII's reign, and Jane was obviously born possibly in the early years of Henry VIII's reign, or just at the end of Henry VII. So they weren't mandatory, and she was going to be, as her life started, maybe somebody in her local community, possibly well known in her area, but not well known enough to record the 17th of February 1507, unfortunately.
You made such a good point, because I am my family's genealogist on my dad's side. And my dad came from a family of 11 kids. And so that's a lot of aunts and uncles for me to try and remember. And out of all of the first cousins, I probably know the order best. However, even with that being said, I can probably only tell you what year the eldest was born and what year my dad was born. Other than that,
exactly.
I could probably get pretty close. But yeah, I mean, if somebody is not keeping track of it, which obviously now we are, but if my family hadn't kept track of it, it would all just be a guessing game, really.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, Carol-Ann, this has been so much fun chatting about the Seymours
Thank you.
and Jane with you. So her book, Jane Seymour, An Illustrated Life, is available. If people would like to go out and get this book, where can they get it?
You can get it from Pen and Sword and most other independent books, shops, Waterstones, etc.
Wonderful. Carol-Ann, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. And it's great to talk to somebody else who's fascinated by the Seymours. We're a semi-exclusive group at the moment.
We are. Let's lead this group, right?
Yeah. We'll have to get Dr. Elizabeth Norton involved as well. I admire her so much for her work on Jane.
Yes, we should do an episode with the three of us. I think that would be a lot of fun.
Oh, that would be good. Yeah.
I'll get working on that. Thank you so much.
Okay. No, thank you very much.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.